Okay, I think we're about ready to start. Welcome back to Composition as Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. We are currently doing live tutorials for harmony, fundamentals of harmony, for composers and performers who want to go back to basics and learn harmony. There is no shame in just taking it back to basics. For myself, I had maybe 20, 15 years of conservatory training in America, high school, undergrad, master's, and I thought I knew what music was. And it wasn't until I did a summer program in France that I kind of awoke and saw that I really didn't know only a small part of the picture. One of the problems in America, I find, if you're coming from American education system, on the one hand, what's great is that for composition, it works really well because you go to school and you have many opportunities to get your pieces performed, at least if you go to a school with lots of musicians. And there's no kind of shtick going on that, oh, you're not ready to compose, you need this many years of training. Versus in Europe, they often don't let you compose until you've had a certain amount of training. So on the one hand, in America, what's really nice is you have that freedom to compose from a very, well, whenever you want to start, and there's no one saying, oh, you're not ready. One of the problems, though, is that we often don't get proper training and we're unaware of it. So definitely when I was in school, I was always felt like I knew the least because you have composers at a lot of these schools. There's like a prize composer, that the faculty thinks it's like the greatest, and it's really not the case. And many times, this person or other people will talk so like you feel like I have no idea what you're talking about. Oh, I can analyze ligety and this. It's so complicated. But at the end of the day, either you can orchestrate or you can't. Orchestration, a lot of what happens in orchestration is really its mechanics. It's basically fundamentals of harmony is a science. Okay, we're learning how chords work. Okay, what is natural. It is a study of nature in a way. Okay, I'm speaking a little bit in hyperbole, but the essence of what I'm saying is the case. Likewise, with fugue, you can't fake the fugue. You have to know the harmony as well as with orchestration. So if you're someone that has been going through a lot of conservatory training and you feel like you're being spun around in the wheel, I have news for you. I think that is the case. I think, unfortunately, training can be incomplete. So I had to move to France to get proper training in harmony, and I'm bringing this to an English-speaking audience for a course I'll be releasing hopefully in the spring. So what we have here is we have a soprano exercise, okay? And we already started this, so we'll be jumping ahead in a second. So in the French tradition, you're going to be hearing above and below. The harder thing to do is to have a soprano exercise and to hear beneath, which is why I'm starting it first, because that's how we build harmony. You have to listen harmonically. Usually we notice the top line, in this case the soprano, and we take for granted what's beneath. But in this case, we're given the top line, so it's forcing us to hear below. So just a quick review of episode 5, which was last week. In episode 5, we were figuring out the bass, and as you can see, we figured out most of the bass. I I'm not going to review the major concepts that we went over. You can check out that video, and I also put chapter markings in the comment section. It wasn't displaying in the video description for some reason, where you can go to each different section if you don't want to watch the entire video or if you want to just go back to something. What I would recommend for this, especially if this way of learning is new, is to watch the video in full to get a flow to see the overall process. And then if you have a genuine interest, to go ahead and go do the exercises. If you feel like you need to take notes, then by all means go back and take scrupulous notes. But be wary, because one of the ways we procrastinate from learning, from actually growing, is by studying. So this was the bass that we figured out from last episode. We're only missing one beat here, and then we're missing two beats, and this is all in the first phrase. Okay. So, first thing to remember from last episode is the 5 to 4 progression, okay? This is not intuitive for a lot of us, certainly wasn't for me, because what poor training I had in harmony in America, which is really just like trying to do a Bach chorale, which is incredibly difficult, incredibly difficult. But with poor training, I always thought, okay, after a 5, you have to go to 1 or 6. False. Okay. In this exercise, we had to go to the 4 because if we try to go to the 1, it's not possible. We have a B flat in the chord. And if we tried to go to the 6, we would have had deceptive parallel octaves. Double check episode 5 to because I have the visual examples. I really break it down, but it's just as a reminder in root position chords that the 5 going to a 4 is very, very common. The other thing I want to remind everyone from episode 5 is that we were introduced with an imperfect authentic cadence. Now, I'm going to have to double check the terminology because one of the tiny little challenges I'm having right now is that because my real training in harmony was in France, a lot of this is like in French in my head, so I just have to double check some of the terms because there can be a little bit discrepancies when going to English. So I'll get back to you on that. But basically, what we discovered in episode 5 is that with this soprano going E to F, if we were to try to harmonize it with a deceptive cadence, which is the good reflex, right? C'est le bon réflexe, we say in French. Okay, that's the logical place you want to do after the 5, so you don't stop the motion with a perfect authentic cadence. But if we do the deceptive cadence here, we're going to have parallel fifths. Pas possible, as you say in French. So therefore, we have to have an alternative. Double check episode 5 if you want the breakdown. This is just a refresh. Okay, so the first thing I want to do now, surprisingly, is not to finish the exercise. Okay, not to finish figuring out the bass, though we need to get that done so we can do the middle voices. But I want to start testing out the middle voices. The reason why I want to start testing out the middle voices is because sometimes when we realize an exercise in the abstract, so we're just getting the bass, then when we try to fill in the middle voices, it doesn't work. So as you can see here, we have a wider spacing. And let me just make sure I didn't skip anything real quick. No, okay, because I'm using a different format. So notice that we have a nice wide spacing. Okay, what does that mean, wide spacing? It means like, for example, between the alto and the soprano, technically, you know, you could get closer to that soprano. You could have a G in the alto, but here we have the D. So it's a nice resonant spacing. This is really important for orchestration and fugue. I mention this because in the French tradition, I have noticed looking back that there seems to be a kind of implicit bias in the textbooks and harmony books that they tend to prefer realizations that are more tightly spaced, more compact spaced. But when it comes to orchestration, I mean, you absolutely need to know how to do a wider spacing. Depending on the ensemble that you're working with, you might not be able to reach all these notes with the instruments that you're writing for. So you need to have multiple possibilities. Especially with fugue, you're going to have to be flexible in your spacing because depending on what's going on in the counterpoint, you may not get the spacing that you initially want, and you're going to need to find an alternative. Okay. Here is a tighter spacing, like I was just mentioning. So notice that from the tenor up, we have D, G, B flat. We can't fit any more notes of the chord. So we call that tighter spacing. It's nice and compact. So I verify that's going to work. Now, don't forget on my website, I have a list, it's all available for free, of the rules for root position chords. I have the most important rules. I'm actually updating it in a moment to have all the rules, but for now I have the essential rules. And we remember when the bass moves by step. So here we're going from a 4 to 5. Other voices move in opposite direction to the bass. Of course, the one exception will be the deceptive cadence, in which the tone goes up to the tonic. But we're not on a deceptive cadence, we're on a 4 to 5. So here we just make sure, does this work? And it does work. However, there is a potential problem. I don't know how often I've mentioned this, and I'm not sure if it's in the essential rules because it's kind of a little bit of a gray area. In general, we don't want more than a tenth, so an octave plus a third between the bass and the tenor, because otherwise we get something, in French you say très vide, okay? What you'll find, especially at piano, is it just feels a little hollow, the sound, when you have a 12th, so an octave plus a fifth between the tenor and the bass. Though sometimes if the tenor is on a pedal note, a note was on the D before, we don't perceive it in that way. So I'm going to do a little bit more research to figure out what are the exact situations where this can be allowed, because I kind of know it intuitively, but I have to kind of put it in words so I can make it more accessible. Because in the French tradition, we don't really explain a lot. It's you really learn by doing. Though you can look in a textbook somewhere. So I'll double check on that. So I just mentioned that because maybe this voicing isn't going to work if we play at piano and we're like, that feels like, a little bit empty. Okay, I want to talk about unnecessary doublings. So for reposition chords, you are almost always going to double the root. That's it. Okay, the root. Of course, that's not the case for the deceptive cadence, in which we double the third. But otherwise, we're almost always going to double the root. Your impulse should be immediately to double the root, double the root, double the root. And of course, you want a complete chord. So you have root, third, fifth, root, but in various different combinations. In this example that I made, notice that the tenor and alto, sorry, the tenor and soprano are on the third. Now, doubling the third is a very pleasing effect, but we're just truly at the basics right now. Reposition chords, it's just not the time to start doing it. As we progress, we will learn how to do it, but you'll notice that when we double the third, well, what happens? Well, if we follow the path of least resistance, right, the tenor wants to go to the A, right? You're going to have to move in opposite direction to the bass because it's a 4 to a 5. But then we have parallel octaves with the soprano. In this case, where we double a third, so we have the B flat and the B flat in soprano in the tenor. I realized it as someone who maybe hasn't mastered harmony, but knows that you can't possibly have parallel octaves, which is a nice improvement. But notice that in order to get a complete chord here, after doubling this third, the tenor has to go down, has to leap down a fifth, okay? And we have the interval of a tritone, right? B flat to E is a tritone. In harmony exercises, in harmony studies, you can't really have a dissonant leaps. As we get further down the line, when we get to, the les septièmes de dominante, okay, which is the dominant seventh chords, then the en souplesse, we say in French, then we kind of relax certain things, but we're not quite there yet. So right now, it's just not acceptable, okay? When I look at this, I just see that you got in a jam, some kind of traffic jam, some kind of difficulty, and you just it's like it's like jumping out of a window. There's got to be a more elegant way to get out of the building. Analogy will break down, of course, if there's a fire, but you get the point. Okay, I want to quickly mention the importance of distinguishing the difference between harmony studies and composition. What we're doing in this course, Fundamentals of Harmony, is learning syntax. It's learning what's natural in music. We're learning a very stylized kind of study. We're learning kind of a summary, in French, it's a résumé, okay, of what was great before. So the music theorists and everyone over many centuries looked at what was common in a lot of great music and created rules. In French, we say des règles. Okay, so by no means should you be mixing this with composition. When you compose, you have to be listening to what you want, and what you want may appear to be a contradiction of a lot of things that we're learning. That is totally fine. One of the things I find with like really the worst type of student, a fake student, is they learn to identify something very quickly. Ah, parallel fifths, parallel octaves, okay? And they don't have a deep understanding of it, and then they apply other places. So, like for example, with my symphony, help us only for orchestra, I've had people say, "Ah, you have parallel fifths. You didn't learn the lesson." No, 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 no. We're not learning harmony studies so that we have very stale and laboratory-like music. We're learning harmony studies so that we have the freedom to do whatever we want. So when you're doing harmony studies, it's really learning the language, right? You're composing in a language that maybe you don't fully understand. That's not a problem, okay? You still can compose beautiful works. But the more that you understand this language, the more that you're going to have control, okay? And you don't realize it now, but once you have good training in harmony, you, in French, you say les voies ouvertes, okay? Les chemins s'ouvrent, okay? The pathways start to open up. You don't realize what you're not able to do right now because your imagination is not capable of doing it. So we're learning harmony to learn syntax, to learn rules, to learn like orderliness. Okay, it's a very restrictive. It is not a place for individual expression. You're learning to bend yourself to the whole, but then when you compose, you have to forget about it completely. If you try to remember what you learned in harmony studies and apply it to composition, you will not apply it correctly, and you'll just end up having music that's not authentic. I recommend if you're serious about doing harmony studies, okay, you have to do the work. Just watching the video will do nothing. It may give the false impression that you're progressing, but you're not progressing. You have to actually do the work, which is posted on my website, okay, or you can go elsewhere to do the work. But I recommend as a minimum, you're going to need to invest 3 to 5 hours a week as a bare minimum, okay, because you have to do at least one full exercise. You want quality, okay? And to get quality, you have to do multiple versions. If you find yourself just rushing to get done, that is a waste of your time because then you're not going to be progressing. It's very, very shallow. So at the bare minimum, you have to expect 3 to 5 hours of work. That's a bare minimum, okay, if you're serious about harmony, and you won't see changes right away. I would say if you're doing 3 to 5 hours of work a week on a regular basis and you're taking it seriously, right? You're actually doing the work and you're reviewing and you're constantly improving, like you take it serious, you own it, you probably won't see any kind of changes in your composition or orchestration or fugue for about 3 months. And then probably after 6 to 9 months, you'll start to feel like, oh, okay, something's different. Like I get it, something's different. I can't put my finger on it. I cannot explain it, but something's different. So that is a sign that you're doing your harmony exercises. Okay? Okay. So now we need to finish up this exercise. So we have what we've been avoiding, which is this octave leap. This octave leap is very controversial because, well, I'm not going to say why it's controversial because we'll get into that when we realize the middle voices, but it is very difficult to realize, which we'll be doing at the end of this exercise. But we need to find the bass note that is best suited for this octave leap in the soprano. So, what I recommend if you just want a fail-proof method, okay, is just make a chart of the chords. We've been over this in the very first episode of this series, and I also went over it again in episode 5. In minor, reposition chords, there's only 4 possible chords. Only 4, which is amazing, but also means you have to be so precise. You have to, like, there's almost only one good way, okay, which is beautiful. Okay, it's amazing. So in this particular case, we have to harmonize the D. So if you need to, just make a chart of the possibilities at the beginning when you do the exercise, so then you can just look at it. Okay, so the D belongs to the one chord, it belongs to the four chord, or belongs to the six. So if we harmonize it with the D, so the one, that is not acceptable because then we have the same harmony. We have re, re, si, la. Okay, we have one, one, and then we change the harmony. No, the harmony has to change with the soprano. This is like chorale style. If we try to harmonize this middle chord with the four, then again, we have the same harmony for beats two and three. Not acceptable. So that only leaves us with one option, which is the six. Now, I would recommend looking at Bach if you don't believe me. Okay, many Bach chorales they'll start on the one and immediately go to the six. Okay, it's just a way. I think it's just a way to buy time, to be honest. But nevertheless, the only option is the six. And just something else to bring to your attention is I am presenting how to figure this out in a very rational way, so that when all else fails, you can use rationality to get the results. But I don't think it's the final piece of the puzzle. I think ultimately, A, you have to do the work, but B, there will be just kind of listening for the flow. Okay. I hope you don't go too mathematically or diametric, not too methodically with these exercises. I hope you still enjoy it and you listen for the overall flow. But for now, I'm just trying to show you fail-proof ways of figuring out the exercises on your own. Okay. Just a very quick rapid fire review of what we covered in episode five, because it's really, really important. So, in episode five, we saw an instance where we had an arpeggio. So, la, si, la, do, mi, re, re, do, la, do, re. Okay, so we have two instances of these arpeggios. Of course, our general impulse in harmony studies is to change the harmony for each beat. So, if you look below over here, you'll see in this first kind of mistake, we tried changing the harmony on the C sharp, and then we found with the E we couldn't really go anywhere else. In this other example, notice how I do a 5-1-5-1 to harmonize do, la, do, right? Okay. And that just feels very cumbersome and sloppy. So occasionally in an exercise, the soprano is going to be moving on the same harmony, probably in order to regain a different spacing. Now, I made this exercise, so I know exactly what happened. I was down here in the A, and it's like, I got to end up in the D. So the only way to get there without just staying stuck within the same couple of chords was to do an arpeggio. So when you have this scenario, you will have a bass that is staying the same, but that is very rare, and there's got to be a clear justification, which would be this arpeggio. In the French tradition, I've never had a teacher explain this to me. They kind of just they never tell you, and then you bump into an exercise, and you're like, it doesn't work, and then they tell you afterwards. So I'm just putting the idea in your head so that doesn't come as a total surprise one day. Okay, so we're mostly done. This is the first phrase. We already figured out the second phrase in the last episode. So we want to start moving to getting the middle voices, and we just have these two notes right here to figure out. Notice that we have la, si, la, right? The soprano is on this A, okay? And we previously harmonized it as a dominant. So then it just one beat, and then it goes back to the A. So you gotta also use like there's gotta be le bon réflexe, we say in French. Okay, you just have to have a certain level of common sense, or just kind of like certain things can't be too difficult, right? So if it's going back to the same note, probably the bass is going to go back to its same note. And again, I don't think rationality will get you everywhere, but it's just to give you something for now. So then I finish up the phrase. So the soprano was doing la, si, la, fa, so, and then the bass is la, so, la, si. can't sing down there. But nevertheless, the bass is moving in opposition to soprano. Okay. Another way to think about it is we harmonize this as a five, and then we do deceptive cadence. But the important thing to notice is that we see the soprano is descending. So our natural impulse will be to have a bass that's ascending. Now, in this exercise here, notice we have a deceptive cadence, like 5 to 6, which we're going to have to voice very soon. And then we go to the 4. This is extremely common. This is like the most common place to go after a deceptive cadence or after a 6 in general, is to go to the 4. And I actually have a full YouTube tutorial on this. It's called How to Exit a Deceptive Cadence. And I tell you how to use leaps, as you can see in this picture, in order to get out of the deceptive cadence. I hope you'll check it out. I also started testing out the different sounds I want to have for my final product, which I hope to have in the spring, which is a full harmony course for reposition chords. And in this tutorial, I tested out a brass quintet sound for the chords. So I hope that you can check it out and let me know if you like how it sounds. Okay, so what next? I think we're gonna pretty much wrap it up there for this episode. This will be a little bit shorter episode. So we have completed the base, and now we need to figure out the rest of the exercise. This exercise, I do want to warn you, is more difficult than previous exercises for a couple of reasons. A, just practically, it's double the length of a lot of the earlier exercises, though this length is the typical length of the Henri Chalon, which is the workbook series that I use when I actually, for the actual course, I'll be using a lot of Henri Chalon. That's what I used when I was in France, and boy, it got me in shape very quickly. It's amazing. Maybe I'll show a picture on it in the next episode. So this is a typical length, so it's going to take longer to realize. We need to figure out the alto and the tenor. There's also a very controversial octave leap that will be very difficult to realize, but we have to tackle it now so that you're prepared for orchestration and fugue because these skills, you need them, okay? In order to help you out, I put the starting notes. Make sure that you do the work, which will be available on the website. If you are just watching the videos, I promise you, you're not going to see any growth or change. You will not, you have to do the work. When you do the work, you'll find it's very difficult. You feel really confused. You might get a little stressed out, but that is the minimum price you're going to have to pay if you want your liberation as a composer or a performer, or if you want to do fugue or orchestration. You need to have a strong level in fundamentals of harmony. If you have any questions, you can either leave them directly in the comments, or I would highly recommend just figuring out on your own, doing the exercises and figuring out for yourself. Thank you so much for watching.